Good afternoon to our viewers in Europe and good morning to our viewers in the United States. My name is Steve Sokol and I'm the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for this virtual discussion on the fall of the Assad regime and the current situation in Syria. And I'm joined by two experts, both of whom are based in Berlin, to sort of unpack the situation there and the broader implications. Dr. Ali Fathollah-Nejad is a German-Iranian political scientist and an author whose work has focused on Iran, the Middle East, and the post-unipolar world. He's also the founder and director of the Center for Middle East and Global Order, and he teaches Middle East politics and international security at the Hattie School. Ali, it's great to have you back. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Steve. Steve, great pleasure.
And Dr. Bente Scheller is the head of the Heinrich Böll Foundation's Middle East and North Africa division. She's based in Berlin, but previously she served as the director of the Heinrich Böll Foundation's Beirut-based Middle East office. Bente, herzlich willkommen.
Thanks for having me.
So I think the news of the last few days and the fall of the Assad regime so suddenly took a lot of people by surprise, and it has certainly dominated the headlines over the weekend and into this week. Bente, I'd like to maybe start with you and ask you whether you were surprised by the sudden collapse of the regime, and if so, why? And if not, why not?
Well, first of all, of course, it's hard to believe that a regime that has been there for 54 years, given the time that both the current president and his father served, can fall within days. That was obviously a surprise. However, I think it was clear that it could happen anytime. The power of Assad's army had been depleted already by 2013, roughly, and he could survive only with the borrowed power he had through the Russian support, the Iranian support. So I think that gave a kind of hollowed out regime. And then the rebels, we saw them training for years. And there was a lot of pressure in Idlib because there were so many internally displaced, like there were double as many people in the province of Idlib than before because of those IDPs. And there was a lot of pressure and questioning regarding, like, why are there so many people under arms if we're not trying to advance, if we're not trying to make sure people can return to their homes. So I think this combination of a weak Syrian army, supporters who couldn't and wouldn't support Assad any longer as they would before, and the rebels feeling the pressure to make advances and having the capability, that contributed a lot. And of course, like Hezbollah's weakness due to the Israeli campaign that left it basically without leadership. It was a huge difference to any time before.
Mm-hmm. Ali, what about you? I mean, I'm guessing that there's a lot of what Bente said that resonates with you, but is there anything that you'd like to add to that, or any other perspectives you'd like to provide?
No, I mean, me too. I was very surprised by the speed with which all of that unraveled and unfolded. And the factors were, I mean, in retrospect, the factors were very, very encouraging in making all of that happen. The weakness of those, Assad regime supporters who have been supporting him a decade ago, Russia and Iran, when it was in big trouble back then. But this time around, the HTS and also other opposition groups, together with Turkey, they used the weakness of the pro-Assad camp, namely Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia. So in retrospect, it makes sense. And plus the fact that it's basically the culmination of a process that has started in Syria with the revolutionary uprising in the wake of the Arab Spring more than a decade ago. So this is the kind of historical framework that we should bear in mind.
So I guess the question is sort of what happens next, and I don't know if either of you sort of want to really read the tea leaves, but it seems as if the future of Syria and sort of a real political transition depends on a lot of both internal but also external factors. And as you both, with your finger on the pulse of what's going on within Syria, but in the region as a whole, how do you see things unfolding from here? And who will play a role in Syria's transition in the coming months? Ali,
Well,
maybe or no, Bente, go ahead.
well, unfortunately, it's not yet Christmas, so I did not yet get the crystal ball that I'd need, but I can certainly point you to some factors that I find relevant for finding out how the future might look like. On the positive side, I definitely list the incredible courage and resilience and stamina of the revolutionaries in Syria, and that is kind of the whole population. Despite everything they were met with, because you have to remember the peaceful protests of 2011, which remained peaceful for the first 6 months, I'd say, they were met with brutal force. And over the course of the conflict, the Syrians have been hit with barrel bombs. Whole cities have been depopulated. More than 100,000 people have forcibly disappeared. Chemical weapons, you name it. They've been really hit with whatever is imaginable, and still they didn't give up. They didn't stray from their path, and therefore I think it's highly encouraging to see a population in this situation that still is committed to seeking a different future. And that inspires a lot of hope in me, because often it is compared with other countries in the region saying, well, it didn't go quite well with Iraq, and just look at what happened with regime change in Afghanistan. But I think these were different. Their regimes were toppled from the outside, and the Syrian regime was toppled from the inside. So I think that's encouraging. And while I think many people rightfully are afraid of what might be next, and will it be an Islamist government? Maybe it's the question that I'm hearing most. I can tell you also, all my Syrian friends and contacts, they are afraid of what might come. Still, they're enthusiastic, and they also say, look at what we achieved. We overcame ISIS, like the Islamic State's governance of parts of Syria, and we suffered heavily. And we survived Assad, and we overcame Assad. So now we feel that nothing will scare us any longer. So therefore, I'm pretty sure that there are many people who are interested in, well, calm moments first. I think everybody is tired of war, but I think also people are willing to take their fate into their own hands. And if HTS tries to impose an Islamist rule, I think they will be faced with protests. They were faced in Idlib, where most of the population is Sunni and quite conservative. Still, they faced protests there. Now imagine if they have to govern a country in which there is a significant Kurdish minority. The Druze, both of them also were part of this offensive, the ones coming from the east, the others from the south. Then you have all kinds of other minorities. I think it would be very difficult for HTS to establish authoritarian rule, and on top of that, an Islamist rule.
Ali, you're nodding your head. I'm sure you have something to add
Yeah,
as well.
no, I agree. I agree. I mean, first of all, we're in uncharted waters. I mean, this is a whole new territory. But first of all, it's a cause of celebration because the Assad regime, as Bente has, laid out, has been one of the most ruthless on planet Earth. So we don't have to, underestimate what the Syrian people have endured for half a decade. And all of that with the support of, the government of my own, homeland, Iran. So this is a cause of celebration. And of course, we have to be careful, and everything is unfolding now, and it's going to be a mixture of internal and external factors that are going to dictate the future of Syria, but also beyond. But as Bente alluded to, there are chances that we're going to see some improvement, and hopefully we're going to see some inclusivity in the new government. Syria is a very diverse society, for sure, and there are a lot of political ideologies, as diverse as Iranian society, by the way. So it's very hopeful. And all of that is happening amid a watershed moment in regional geopolitics, where we see a geopolitical reshuffling of great proportions. This is the end of what we basically knew about Middle East geopolitics in terms of Iran as a regional superpower, basically, with its kind of network of alliances and militias in the region, the so-called axis of resistance. All of that does not exist anymore. So we're in a whole new territory, and plus we're going to have Mr. Trump entering the White House in January. So there's also a lot of questions about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right in sort of putting this in the broader context. There are even more unknowns, and that's a little bit of what I was alluding to in terms of some of these internal and also external forces and factors that need to be taken into consideration. And we'll certainly broaden the aperture in the course of our conversation and talk a little bit about sort of the Iranian role, the response in Iran, the situation and response by Israel. But before we do that, Bente was talking a little bit about HTS. We haven't really talked that much about Abu Mohammed al-Jolani, the leader of HTS, who's largely credited with the overthrow of the Assad regime. Can you tell us a little bit more about him and how we should sort of understand him and what role he and HTS play in the weeks and months ahead? Either of you can go ahead.
Well, he has a very radical background. I mean, you know that he was part of Al-Qaeda, and therefore I think suspicions are there. How far has he really distanced himself from that? But I think since HTS, the organization that he's heading, already in 2016 fell out with ISIS, and they have been fighting ISIS. That is a factor that really should tell us here we don't only have his word, we see the deeds, and we have to really understand that HTS, for not only now, but already years back, they formulated they are a nationalist group, a nationalist Islamist group. So that means, and what they want also to express with that they are not into committing attacks abroad. So they focus on Syria. Their ambitions don't go outside the borders of Syria. I think that's quite relevant. But I think he is an interesting figure as such. I think with the announcements that he's made, we can see that he understands politics, and maybe there is a strategy among, maybe it is a strategy to pretend he's nicer, and he pretends maybe things the West wants to hear. I think partly we can see that it doesn't only come from understanding that, but as a governing party in Idlib, they learned quite a lot about what people want, and that for the people there on the ground, it's much more relevant to have the services that are relevant for the daily life, like water, electricity, food. This is much more relevant than ideology for most people, not only in Idlib, but I think all over Syria, where 90% of the population in all areas lives below the poverty line. And then I think he also comes from an interesting family, because I know that his father was an opposition leader already under Hafez al-Assad. His father was part of the Damascene Spring movement in 2000 when Bashar al-Assad became president, and there was a slight array of opening. So he comes from a political family. And I think that is, of course, a very different view on things. It gives him also a more like a longer history and understanding how to play politics, but also how to govern. We will need to see how long it lasts, but I think it is already interesting to see that it's not only him saying something, but he's surrounded by people who are implementing that. A very pragmatic approach, and I think this experience in governance is an additional value, because look at the administration in Idlib. Even though it was a rebel province, it was often bombarded, it was crowded, it was not a great situation, but he managed to establish quite a modern administration there.
Yeah.
And they were in a better state than the regime areas in Aleppo and around Aleppo. That is an achievement from which I think we can hope that this management quality will play a role in putting together, first of all, a technocrat interim government, but also keeping the vision for the needs of the people.
Ali, there have been some media reports that that make it seem as if there are discussions about whether HTS should be removed from from the list of designated terrorist organizations in various countries. And one of our viewers actually posed a question about this. Do you think that that's likely, given the role of HTS in bringing down the Assad regime?
Well, I think this is, this is based on conditions, and we don't know if, it depends on the conditions of the U.S. government. The U.S. government has announced to do so, and gonna be, the West, including Europe, are certainly interested to stabilize Syria. So they're not interested in, in keeping this, this designation with HTS, longer than necessary. But I think the key point here are the conditions, and I think conditions should be set for such a removal because it would pave the way for all kinds of support that could be directed to the new rulers. But conditions should include inclusive governance, democratic standards, respect for human rights and minorities. All of that are crucial. Not only from a Western perspective, but also from the perspective of the Syrian population, but also from stability at large in Syria and beyond. So all of that is key to have it, to have those conditions.
You're both in Berlin, and on Deutschlandradio, I heard about literally thousands of Syrians taking to the streets to celebrate. And I'd be very curious to hear from you both about how you would describe the mood in Germany about the collapse of the Assad regime. But this has also reignited the debate about migration and about refugees. And there's a whole new debate that has opened up about trying to suspend applications for asylum and even sending people back, people who in some cases have spent over a decade living in Germany, now have German citizenship, and a life in Germany. What is the mood in Germany like about this news, and how is that playing out? Ali, maybe you first this time, and then we can bring Bente.
I was in Neukölln on the day, and in where a lot of Syrians are living. So, as I explained, all of that is amazing. This is of historic, value. The reactions from some German politicians have been utterly distasteful. I think this is the least one could say. Once, those politicians, with a kind of provincial mind, I'd say, see that, Assad has been toppled, they're gonna, ask those refugees to go back home. Many of Syrians, of course, they would love to go home. So it's not upon German politicians to tell them what to do. Some politicians even, proposed giving them 1,000 euros to return, but this is absolutely ridiculous. Sorry for putting it like that, but beyond that, I think there is a large potential with the Syrian civil society, and that has been organized also in Germany to work for the future of Syria and to involve them, to get them involved. So this is the path that German politicians should rather look into. Whether a sizable proportion of Syrian refugees is going to return, going to depend on the kind of inclusivity of post-Assad Syria. But there is no need to push them. So, yeah.
Yeah, I describe the mood as quite enthusiastic among Syrians. Especially during that night. We were all online, we were all awake. And really, when we saw the first pictures from Umayyad Square in Damascus, it was amazing. My phone was buzzing. It was quite an incredible mood already. And what happened then during the next day, I found it so fascinating because many people before spoke about the wall of fire having collapsed in the years so, like when they went out to the street and protested. And so for many of them, this was a topic they raised before, but then I saw all the names changing on my phone, and I was wondering with some of them, well, this sounds familiar, but who is this? And then I just noticed that everybody started using their original name again. Because until now, even those who arrived here safely and who felt that they had overcome fear, they didn't dare to speak under their real name often because they were afraid for consequences for their families back in Syria. And this is really such a major change. And also, people are here on public discussions who said, well, this is the first time I dare to speak on Syrian politics because I think nobody will come after my family in Syria any longer. So I think that really shows the degree to which the regime would exert power over people way beyond their borders. And this kind of maybe describes the mindset also many Syrians find themselves in. Having lived all this, and now the situation is completely different. Therefore, many also described it as comparable to the fall of Berlin, a wall for like Germans. And therefore, I particularly felt what you just said, Ali, that it was the wrong moment to jump into this debate about how to get rid of Syrians. Also, because many Syrians who are here really appreciated that in 2015, the government was very open on receiving refugees. They felt that Germany did what others didn't do. And therefore, I think there is a special form of relationship, a gratitude, and we are risking that over these announcements. I think it is coming also because the elections are now, like, we'll be having snap elections, as you probably know, already in February. So it's already the preparation period, and everybody is trying to find the topics to engage voters. But I think also many Syrians who came here earlier already have German citizenship. So I feel that the political parties in Germany have not yet recognized that they also have a potential to have them amongst their voters, which is quite a short-sighted calculation, I think, for this, but also for future relations with a new Syria. We could largely benefit from that, and I think we're about to risk that over this kind of announcements.
And actually, let's add to that, to the election factor that you mentioned. There's also lack of knowledge and interest into what is really happening in Syria. I mean, just a few months ago, I remember there were some German politicians calling on Syrian refugees to return to Syria because Syria under Assad would be stable. So we've had those calls all over again. So I think it's a combination of those factors, which is very unfortunate. But it's not the majority of German politicians, of course.
At the same time, it's often the same politicians here who say, well, look, Syria, it will now all become a big disaster. Stability is gone. The Islamists are coming. It's the very same politicians who then are talking about sending refugees back. So that's the level of analysis and the dedication.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Makes it even more absurd.
I mean, you both have been covering the region for a very long time, and I think it's interesting to think back to 2011 and the Arab Spring, and where we've seen the overthrow of oppressive regimes and of dictators in other countries, but not all of those countries fulfilled the promise that I think many people had in the immediate moments of the Arab Spring, where there was a real sense of euphoria and optimism. And I guess as you look at the situation in Syria, are there lessons that can be drawn from the experiences of countries like Egypt or even Afghanistan as one thinks about the future of Syria?
I mean, first of all, I think before talking about the lessons, I think it has been a false kind of lens that we have used in the West to analyze what is going on in the Middle East since 2010, 2011, with the outbreak of the so-called Arab Spring. You remember the kind of mainstream narrative that became dominant even in expert commentary
Circles.
was that the Arab winter was replacing for sure the Arab Spring, and everything was over. There was authoritarian reconstitution. But the truth of the matter is that although this may be true, you have to look at particular case-to-case studies. So you cannot generalize the situation. What you can generalize is that Europe's immediate neighborhood is afflicted with structural crises that are driving those revolutionary processes, socioeconomic and political. There are a lot of socioeconomic problems. There's a high density of political authoritarianism, and those are saline features that are driving forces for change, also given the demographics of the region. This change may be torpedoed by internal or external factors at some point. They're going to be, reconstitution of authoritarianism at some point. But this is an open-ended, this is a long process, this is a long-term process. So first of all, what has happened in Syria showed us that we cannot really be sure about authoritarian resilience. The very fact that the Assad regime crumbled in such a short period of time was also because of the lack of popular support. There was no popular support. Even its own military did not believe in the future of the system. So all those factors are something that you could also observe in other cases as well, in other countries as well. In terms of the lessons, I would only point before I would be interesting to learn from what Bente thinks. In the case of Egypt, when Mubarak was toppled, the opposition, and of course, the best organized opposition was the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a Sunni Islamic fundamentalist organization. And the other more progressive forces did not have the time to organize in order to present themselves for the elections that were organized prematurely. So this is also, I believe, a challenge, so that all, the diversity of Syrian population should be able to organize themselves before, before something very important such as elections happen, so that we're not going to see the kind of, for instance, HDS as an organized entity taking over too much power.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. The time matters. And I think here I felt that there was very little patience over the past years from those who were not involved, not concerned. I mean, from a point of view from Europe, where everybody has a system in which he or she is kind of settled, and where all that we have to fear is populist parties and changes in politics, I think it is very easy to raise the expectations of what should be there and how it should be. However, I think maybe we should not just compare amongst the states in the region, but we should also go back to our own past. I mean, the French Revolution is something where we are extremely proud of its values and the achievements. However, we tend to forget how long the road to that was and how much violence was involved in bringing this all about. And of course, it's a painful period. The achievements are great, but I think today there is an expectation you topple a regime and then everything becomes democracy and it goes smoothly. This is not how usually things work. And therefore, I think we need to give time and we need to beware of milestones that might not really tell us anything. For example, with Iraq, when things were like the milestone that was formulated were the elections. Everybody was focused completely, like from the outside, on holding elections and declaring, well, now we achieved it. But if these are not representative and if they are not if there is no possibility to bring about a state in which people believe, then it's all hollow. This is why the Iraqi army or the Afghan army crumbled when like the Taliban were coming, or also like what we saw in Mosul when the so-called Islamic State was coming. The reason why they did not fight or they were not successful in fighting these movements was not that they were ill-armed, especially in Iraq. They were very well equipped. However, what to fight for? If there is no state that you believe in, you'll drop your arms. And basically, this is what the Syrian regime suffered. This was not newly established, but the link, the commitment, and like the loyalty of the army, it was not there because the state didn't give them anything to believe in. And particularly in this situation, the soldiers from Aleppo told us, well, We knew it was coming, and then we saw that Assad back then was in Moscow. He returned later on, and then he fled again. But at the point of the offensive, Assad was in Moscow. But before the army had been ordered to stay in their positions, they were not allowed to take days off. So just imagine sitting there, you receive the strange order, you see the president is outside the country, and then rebels are coming. So I think what we definitely need to learn, if we want stability, we need regimes that inspire loyalty because of their appreciation for the citizens, and that citizens know what they have in that regime. Otherwise, it will never be stable. And I think we should watch out carefully. We see so many authoritarian regimes still in the region. And with Egypt, I'm hearing it a lot that Europe is so proud of having a stable partner, also important because of the huge population Egypt has. And this is why al-Sisi is kind of the favorite dictator. We do deals with him because we believe in him as a guarantor for stability. But I think often stability through authoritarian rule is just like borrowed time. And if they collapse, it can be really terrible and ruin all perspectives of stability we have.
So, since you've brought up this point of stability and sort of the goal of achieving a lasting peace in Syria, I'd like to maybe talk a little bit about the role that the international community can play. This was something I wanted to bring up maybe at the end of our conversation, but it fits nicely here. President Biden welcomed the fall of Assad by saying it was a, quote, historic opportunity. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said that the Syrian people have suffered terrible hardships and that the news of the end of, or that the end of Assad's rule over Syria is therefore good news. But that sort of begs the question of what sort of a role can the international community play, particularly countries like France and Germany, which have agreed to work with Syrian rebels. But this comes at a time when, as you alluded to, Bente, the political situation in both countries is pretty disrupted at the moment, and the attention is elsewhere. When one thinks about domestic politics, there's a lot of inward focus in the U.S. as we head toward the inauguration date, but also in France and Germany right now. How do each of you see the international community playing a role in creating stability and a framework for a lasting peace?
Well, I think first of all, everybody should realize that it was not Western states that saved the Syrians when they were under attack of their cruel regime. And particularly the US role in drawing a red line in 2013 when Obama announced that or it was actually 2012 when he first said it, that the use of chemical weapons would be a red line. And then it happens. And it happens many times until the big attack in 2013 in August. There had been tens of attacks already, and it goes unnoticed, or nobody wants to tackle it because then you would need to enforce the red line. And then it happens big time, and there is a deal that allows the perpetrator to get away with it, and not even the entire chemical weapons program is destroyed, so he's able to use them again in 2017. I think this really makes it very difficult to now tell the Syrians what to do and how to do it, because in the end they had to solve it for themselves. Nobody would come to rescue them. And nonetheless, of course, we can offer certain services. I think some of them are really, really relevant. And that is, for example, justice efforts. To support them in justice efforts would mean one of the ways that we can use to prevent revenge. I think with what happened, it's natural that there are people feeling a need for revenge, and I think it is really amazing that we have not seen any of this happening. But this is also because I'm hearing that there are many others who say, well, no, this is not the way we want to go. We are not like them. And we will not allow the system now to convert us into something that we never wanted to be. However, I think justice matters. And one of the drivers that we heard in 2011 from our partners and friends that was fueling the revolution was that they never got justice for the massacres of Hafiz al-Assad on his own population in the 80s. So if we can support them in documenting and filing and finding ways of bringing things in front of courts, and Germany has had some really excellent cases already, where regime members of the Syrian regime, people who had been part of the secret service and involved in torture, were in front of German jails under the principle of universal jurisdiction. And it was not a very satisfying effort because in the end it was just very few and they were not the highest ranking. But still, people felt very satisfied that they could tell their story. They could say what happened, that it was kind of approved, like a German court qualified it as facts. And therefore, I think these efforts matter. And if they can be held in Syria by Syrian courts, that will be much stronger. And still, I think external factors can be to contribute in making it possible to have documentation done properly, especially in this moment where there is so much available when archives open up, when lists come out of detainees that disappeared, etc.
Ali, any thoughts from you on how the international community can play a role
Yeah,
in
I mean, I agree
supporting?
with Bente. I mean, in the international community's support in terms of transitional justice and accountability is key. Also, Western policymakers should not view Syria through the refugee lens, because otherwise we're going to go into a wholly different direction.
Yeah.
But understand that helping to democratize Syria is a key, at least European and probably also Western in the Western security interest.
Hmm.
So this should be viewed in that in that lens, and also as I alluded to earlier, German policy vis-a-vis the new Syria should be done, in my view, in coordination with the Syrian civil society groups that have been organizing also in Berlin for the past decades. So all of that, one should help them to get access and to get included in the new Syria.
Hmm. When thinking about the international arena, we obviously have to think about neighboring Turkey, and I think it's clear that Recep Tayyip Erdogan's goal has to be stability in Syria so that there aren't spillover effects. But there are some major concerns, although there are opportunities for Turkey. Some have even described Turkey as the biggest beneficiary of the fall of the Assad regime. I'd be interested in hearing from both of you how the collapse of the Assad regime might impact Turkey and what Turkey's role could be in this. Ali, maybe you first this
Yeah, I
time.
mean, obviously, as a NATO member state, the West has, specific access to Turkey, and it should use this influence to how, to see what Turkey is going, is planning in terms of Syria. I mean, if Erdogan's interest, which is to send back a lot of Syrian refugees, going to be satisfied, maybe there is room for some compromises, and one should be also wary about Turkey's policy vis-a-vis the Kurds. I mean, things still, a lot of things are still unfolding. We're not sure about the situation of the Kurds in the future Syria, but this is something that we should be looking into.
Yeah, I think for Erdogan, it was quite a long story to come where he is now with the Assad regime and without the Assad regime. But I think in the end, probably it might have looked better for him to get rid of
Mhm.
it because of the normalization efforts that he actually proposed, but that were never responded to from Damascus. I think he felt very much the arrogance of the Assad regime that always felt that others should apologize and then maybe Assad would normalize, and this was not sustainable. I think for Erdogan, it was clear that he already had some influence in Syria. On the one hand, of course, in northwestern Syria, where the rebels were, he was not that well connected with HTS, but of course, that would be an area that was completely dependent in terms of economy and trade on Turkey. And the influence was tangible in daily affairs because the mobile phone network, for example, was like the Turkish one, it was reaching far into Syrian territory. People would pay with Turkish currency. electricity would partly come from there. So it's clear that this is already a kind of soft way to extend Turkish influence. Then, of course, the direct influence through the groups of the what is called Syrian National Army, maybe mainly those were responsible for controlling the areas right next to the Turkish border. He was establishing kind of buffer zones against an expansion of Kurdish autonomy, as he saw it. He has been meddling there quite a lot. And therefore, it's not that he now has an opportunity that he didn't have before. But of course, things are much clearer. It expanded whatever he had, and he doesn't have to deal with Assad any longer, who would not be reliable and who he saw he couldn't make any advances with.
Shifting gears a little bit, but picking up on one of the threads that we've talked about, both Moscow and Tehran have supported the Assad regime since the beginning of the civil war. And I think it's fair to say that the collapse of the Assad regime is a strategic defeat for both Russia and Iran in the region. Of course, Moscow is so focused on the war in Ukraine, its attention to Syria has waned. Iran has now lost a major route to send weapons to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Do either of you think that we will see a sort of complete pullback by Iran and Russia in terms of interests in Syria, or how do you see both of these countries, each of these countries, maintaining their ties and interests? Ali, you're nodding, and obviously you follow Iran very closely. Why don't you start with that one?
Sure. I think there's a difference between the Russian and Iranian cases, although they've been both supporting the brutality of the Assad regime. I've just seen that, there was some sources telling Bloomberg that some kind of a deal between Moscow and the new leadership in Syria about Russia keeping their two military bases may be on the horizon. So we'll see. But in the case of Iran, I think this is, the return of Iran to the Syrian scene going to be very, very difficult, if not impossible, because as Giordani also said in his speech, is that he very much connects the disasters in Syria with Iranian involvement. And this is, I think, a view that is shared by a lot of Syrians. So, for the Iranians, it was a huge humiliation. They were utterly surprised by the speed at which all of this unfolded. Imagine that, since October 7th, a process of unraveling has started, especially from early 23 onwards, of the Iran-led axis of resistance, with Israel's targeted killings of top commanders of the Iran-Hamas Hezbollah trio, all the way to the culmination of this process in late September of this year with the decapitation and decimation of Hezbollah. And also Hezbollah didn't have the troops, didn't have the command structure to send in troops. There was a ceasefire, of course, that was preceded, that was used by the HDS for their blitz offensive. So Hezbollah couldn't be mobilized. The Iranians called upon pro-Iranian militias in Iraq, the PMF, the Popular Mobilization Forces, to mobilize them to go to Syria to help Assad. But they rejected the call. So this is huge. This is huge, and I think there is absolutely huge confusion and a lot of frustration, a lot of criticism also within the system. Why didn't Iran do anything? After all, Iran not only invested a lot of, basically blood, but not only Iranian blood, but also Afghan blood, Pakistani blood, with all those brigades that they assembled, Hezbollah, Lebanese blood. But also they spent a lot of money, tens of billions of dollars, camouflaged as so-called credit lines for Syria, or Iranian oil, exports to Syria. All of that. There's nothing left. So Iran has lost not only militarily and politically, but also financially. And I mean, of course, the Iranian government is now saying that we're called upon the new leadership to, to form an inclusive government. But this is, a small hope to somehow get involved within such a constellation. But I highly doubt that this would be possible. The only scenario in which I think that Iran may be able to return is a total destabilization of Syria, because this is what Iranian regional policies were always, smart to abuse, the kind of weak states in the region. So if something like that, chaos emerges, then maybe we're going to see some kind of, Iranian influence there. But, for now, it seems that the game is really over for the Iranians.
Bente, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, no, I think that is quite a complete picture already. For Iran, that is really fascinating how much they lost actually. What an investment and how it went. For Russia, I think it is a different case. For Russia, I think there were very different interests at different times. Everybody's always saying there was such a long relationship between Syria and Russia dating back to the Soviet Union, but actually this is not the case. Russia only ever came in when Syria's relations with the West were bad, and then it tried to make use of that. And this is exactly what happened in 2011. Before that, relations were not particularly good. They were good the last time in 2005 when Syria came under pressure by Western countries because of the murder of the former Lebanese Prime Minister Hariri. And then Russia came in, then things got a bit more open, and Russia only came back in 2011. And for Russia, Syria was great because it was a distraction. Everybody was having their eyes on Syria, so Russia could prepare what would be happening in Ukraine. It could also already test during the Syria war. It could use Syria as a soil to test a number of weapons, etc. So I think Syria had several functions for Russia, and I think that it was something that it had been exhausted now. Also, however, because Assad is not an easy ally. Whenever there was a Russian plan, Assad was quick to ruin it. Russia tried before to have European money flowing to Syria by saying, well, we allow the refugees to return, and therefore you reconstruct. As soon as Russia had launched this plan and said we can facilitate and we can twist Assad's arm and make him take back refugees. As soon as that happened, the Syrian regime launched a new law, or it leaked a new law, basically making it impossible for refugees to return because their property would be confiscated.
Right.
And we have several of these instances. Russia was also one of the guarantors of the chemical weapons deal, who continued using chemical weapons, Assad. So I think they were also kind of fed up. The normalization the Russians had been pushing for to enable reconstruction and make sure money comes so they can also profit from it. Well, Assad went to the Arab League and he was on the red carpet, but he never did anything that was expected from him. And this is why I think Russia in the end found him too complicated. And I think the calculation they might have done now is, of course, their image is damaged by that. But they still have the air base in Maymin. They have the port. They didn't have an air base before. I'm sure they will try to negotiate for it, and they might try and pay and keep it. But for the time being also, they're just waiting. They know that Syria might end up in a chaos. It might become a failed state. And possibly they could come back and pretend now they are the saviors because they have infrastructure, they have knowledge, they know how to manage it. And this is maybe a political calculation that makes it easier for them to live with the image being harmed for the moment.
Yeah. We're running out of time, but before we come to a close, I want to bring in one more topic. Before we went live, we were talking a little bit about Israel and commented on the fact that Israel had really stepped up its airstrikes across Syria during this period of a power vacuum. The Israeli military reported that they had carried out something like 350 airstrikes on Syrian territory since Sunday, that they've destroyed numerous weapon sites and basically eliminated the Syrian Navy. I think, Bente, you were saying that this is far more strikes just in a few days than over the last 12 years altogether. How do each of you read this uptick in military attacks by Israel at this time?
Well, I think it has to be seen in the general perspective of Israel that it is under threat from a hostile neighborhood, and the experience of October 7th with Hamas terrorist attacks, of course, heightened the sensitivity for threats. So I think what they are currently doing is to try and eliminate threats. And after Hamas and Hezbollah, I think now they're going after the Syrian infrastructure, like weapon arsenals, and particularly the chemical weapons. So from that point of view, I can see this reasoning. However, I find it really amazing in this situation, in this very fragile and vulnerable situation. It is very important factor how external powers meddle. These attacks are something that Syrians are also appalled by. I was talking to someone traveling from Damascus to the Sednaya prison, this famous prison where now everybody is going to search for their missing relatives. And they said just in the vicinity of that prison, there were plenty of airstrikes, which create insecurity on top of all the other insecurities. So I think it's quite risky, but possibly even more risky are the advances on the Golan Heights, part of them having been occupied by Israel in 1967. There was a buffer zone exactly to prevent Israeli troops and Syrian troops clashing with each other. There were United Nations troops stationed, or there are, but Israel went into that zone, and I think the signals and symbols they've been using, like putting up a flag there, announcing that the Golan forever will remain Israeli, that is very dangerous in this situation. And I think many Syrians feel this is a provocation.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there would have been a great chance to open a new page between these two countries,
Yeah.
which are officially still in a state of war. Israel did a lot of things over the past 10 years that really helped the Syrians. They had Syrians treated in Israeli hospitals, for example, or when the Syrian civil defense came under pressure and hundreds of them needed to be evacuated when the regime was taking back their areas, so they all went through Israel. So I think there are connecting points that would allow for a different future. However, starting off on this foot might not really make it easy.
So really sort of a missed opportunity.
Well, I think that might be the case. I mean, still here we might see a change, but these initial movements were not really prone to open the way for a better constructive relationship.
Yeah. Ali, do you have anything to add to
No,
that?
I totally agree. I mean, this is a very risky endeavor. There's a raison d'être behind Israeli attacks on military infrastructure in Syria for the reasons that Bente laid out. The numbers have been actually 480 within 48 hours. But the Golan Height issue is much more problematic as well. So, I mean, the backlash could be very detrimental to Israel if all of this is going to, provoke a sense among the Syrian population that Israel is not a friend but a foe. So
Mm-hmm.
this is although one could, understand the kind of raison d'être to avoid that, another, military threat going to reemerge from Syria and weapons going to, be handed to the wrong groups. It's still a very, very risky project.
Mm-hmm. Well, Bente, although at the outset you said you did not have your crystal ball and could not read too much into what's going on, I want to thank both of you for sharing your knowledge and insights and understanding of Syria and the broader region with us today. I found this to be an incredibly thoughtful but also thought-provoking conversation where you've pointed out a number of things that we need to be watching in the weeks and months ahead. This will continue to be an unfolding story, not one which will be resolved quickly. And I'm certainly grateful to have experts like you in the circle of the American Council on Germany to share your insights. So, Bente, herzlichen Dank. It was wonderful to have you with us today. And Ali, many, many thanks for joining us today as well.
Thank you to
Thank you
both.
very much.
It was a pleasure.